Excuse me, I got the COVID. I'm just kidding. That was not a dry cough. That was just me clearing my throat, if you like. Hello, everybody. Welcome to The Brunt of It. I am your host, Joel Van Brunt. It is almost the end of the week. Got one more day. But if you, first time seeing the show, here's my pitch. If you're going to outsource your thinking, why not do it with somebody you trust, like me? But in case you're not going to outsource your thinking, why not let me point you in the right direction to increase your awareness and give you a fuller picture of things going on? I can act as an aggregator to help point you in the right direction. I am interested in grown-up conversations. I don't know about you. I am interested in grown-up conversations, not fifth grade recess shouting matches, which is what the state of the current political debate looks like. Of course, COVID has gotten politicized quite extensively, and so it's shouting matches. I'm interested more in adult conversations, grown-up conversations. It's kind of weird that we have this excess of kindness and civility that's become niche, right? I mean, who would have thought that the excess of kindness and civility would be niche in today's world? That maybe makes an opportunity for this to have an impact. Intro to me, I have 21 years of experience in the military and private sectors in a number of different areas. I've been in aviation, tourism, entertainment, politics, academia, entrepreneurship, government, and the military. I have served as an executive in both the military and in the private sector with teams of up to 280, 290 people. I've hired, I have fired, and I have recruited. As an adult, I've lived in 16 different locations across 8 states, and I've worked out of 12 states with my military and civilian roles. And I've experienced the New England culture, the Southern culture, the Midwest culture, the left coast culture, and also the Hawaiian culture, where I've lived most recently. I hope to help guide you through the fog of war in life, fog of war being conflicting information, contradictory models, experts, the left, the right, all this swirling information, philosophy, politics, religion, cultural, social issues. And I aim to help guide you through the fog of war and make sense of it. Fog of war is a military term that comes from MCDP-1, Warfighting, which is the Marine Corps' first publication. Page 6, if you want to look up the fog of war. And you can Google that document and you can find that. So anyway, welcome. New show. Got a lot to cover. My process, I kind of go through the news on a daily basis. I open up all the different news sources, Fox News, CNN, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, Vox, National Review, and my main aggregator is Real Clear Politics, and that opens me up to Washington Examiner, the New York Post, a whole bunch of other sources of information. So good stuff. I do listen to other podcasts, but they typically don't influence my prep for this show. Most of this stuff is my own stuff. I do take recommendations from people that I know, connections that I know, mostly just people sharing information, not necessarily wanting me to incorporate into the show. They may not even be aware of the show yet. So I do take information from a number of different sources, and I try to break it down into themes that we can talk about. And my main theme is trying to equip ourselves with thinking better about the world and thinking better about each other, equipping our thinkers with these principles and these techniques that can help lead to a fuller appreciation of reality, really. And I covered a couple principles yesterday that I wanted to bring back up. The principle of awareness. So are you aware of the other side? Are you aware that there is another side? Are you aware of the strongest argument of the other side? Or is it just a steel man that you can, easily tear down to support your point of view? So principle of awareness, a principle of discernment. Are you interrogating the information coming in and figuring out what the purpose of it is and how it's going to either help or hurt you? Are you interrogating that information coming into you? Whether it's from a person, an anchor, a commentator, a writer, a journalist, and the principle of sticky narratives. So we all take these data points and then we draw a narrative through it, usually to confirm our prior beliefs And just by drawing that narrative between data points, we get a sticky narrative, and it's really, really hard to push against that narrative with outside information to make you update the way you think about things. So I call that sticky narratives. So I've covered that, and so the big principle of the show is to try to equip you to think better and maybe inform you of some other points of view that you may not be aware of if you've been riding the confirmation bias train. So here we go. COVID update improvements. COVID improvement plan updates. So 1% improvements. I'm trying to schedule this live stream around my work schedule now since I got hired back with the PPP. So that's been interesting, and I had a little bit better prep for this show than yesterday's show, and I kind of did it periodically from last night all the way up until just a few minutes ago. So I'm trying to get better at that, and I have to really manage a little bit better because throughout the day working from home, I'm on the phone quite a bit. I'm talking to my direct reports. I am developing priorities for how we're going to move forward. And it's a really interesting time because our company doesn't have demand, and we're not sure we're going to get the demand back. So it's a very different time, and we're having to work through some of those issues in prioritizing and whatnot. I'm going to adjust this camera just a little bit. There we go. Try to crowd out some of the toilet paper back there, but I've got toilet paper. Shh, don't tell my neighbors. Okay. Anyway, so let's dive into it today. We're going to, I do want to update one more COVID improvement plan doohickey. So I've been day trading, and I've been waking up early to try to day trade and learn the stock market. And I had a great, awesome trade this morning that was really great. And then I had a really poor trade that, so basically I had a carryover stock from yesterday, and yesterday my position was increasing as the stock price was decreasing. I was starting to buy larger shares in order to take advantage when it turned back north, and I would get it would turn green for me. Well, I held that overnight, and then in the off hours it went up above my price point, and then when it opened in the morning it just sunk. So it opened below my price point, and then it just sunk, and it never recovered for the day. So now I'm in a dilemma. Do I swing trade this, turn into a swing trade and hold on to it for a while with the position I have, or do I cut my losses? And my losses are pretty, they're a lot right now. So that loss aversion, I'm working through that in my own psyche to figure out, what to do. And I'll look for some indicators tomorrow to see how the week's going to close, and, hopefully get out of the position without too much pain. So we'll see. I might carry it through into next week, but I'm not sure yet. So I talk a lot about 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Sometimes it's 2 steps forward, 3 steps back. And that was kind of my day trading experience this morning. But that's okay. That's okay, because it's pretend money. And what better way to learn about those things than with pretend money rather than real money? Maybe someday I'll do the real money thing, but first get comfortable with this pretend, simulated trading account, and then we'll go from there. But it was one of those mornings this morning. So we talked about the principles. Now I want to jump into some news, and I wanted to choose 2 pieces that kind of help to frame or help to really flesh out this principle of awareness, principle of discernment, and these sticky narratives. And one's from the Washington Post, and it's titled, and this is going to get a little bit into politics pretty quickly. So it's titled, We Are All Zelensky Now. Okay. We're all Zelensky now. Zelensky was the Ukrainian, newly elected president that, was the famous Ukraine call that led to President Trump's impeachment. So this is by Catherine Rampel, and I want to read a bit of this with these principles of awareness, principles of discernment, and principles of sticky narrative in the back of your mind. Okay? So do us a favor, though. Before we provide life-saving equipment, praise the president. Do us a favor, though. Before we rescue the U.S. Postal Service, raise postage prices on the president's perceived political enemies. Do us a favor, though. Before we assist states in fiscal crisis, reopen your economies when we say so. Oh, and hand over your immigrants. A more public service-oriented president might view a viral pandemic as a time to prioritize saving lives and providing services and funds wherever needed. But to President Trump, the coronavirus outbreak is just another opportunity for a shakedown. This should have been obvious given how he exploited another country's crisis. Last summer, as Ukraine was desperate for aid that Congress had appropriated, but that the Trump administration had frozen, Trump held his perfect phone call, and President Vladimir Zelensky, Trump told Zelensky, per the rough transcript, I would like you to do us a favor because, our country's been through a lot and Ukraine knows a lot about it. He then asked for Zelensky's help in smearing a domestic political rival. It wasn't really exactly that, in my view. To many voters, this exchange involving a faraway country may have seemed no different than the usual horse trading that U.S. officials conduct with counterparts abroad. Trump calls himself a brilliant dealmaker, after all. Maybe this episode was just another boring political negotiation. It wasn't, of course. It was about extracting a favor designed to help the president's personal interests rather than his country's. Okay, I'm going to stop there. Let's analyze this from the principle of awareness, the principle of discernment, and sticky narrative. Okay, so principle of awareness. Now this is an opinion piece, so there's a lot of leeway that this author has. But are you even aware that there's another side when you read this? I mean, you might be aware. And as I go through this, there's really no discussion of the other point of view, the other perspective. So that's the principle of awareness. Principle of discernment. What's the purpose of this author in writing this article? It's comparing the current crisis with this perfect phone call with Zelensky and basically a shakedown. So it's comparing, this shakedown narrative with the current virus pandemic and kind of the reaction of the administration to that. So what's the purpose? The purpose is to basically trigger your emotions, looking back at the Russian collusion, the Ukrainian phone call and the subsequent impeachment, and it's trying to confirm some of those prior existing strong emotional states. Is it offering you any new information? No, it's kind of drawing an analogy the analogy might be new, but the analogy just simply confirms perhaps your prior beliefs. Is there any kind of persuasion that's happening with people who might disagree with this article? None that I can tell at all. It's not really a persuasive piece, in my view. It's more of a piece that is just going to appeal to the base. Appeal to the base of the readers of the Washington Post. Okay, so that's, and then lastly, the sticky narrative. So this narrative about the shakedown and about, the Zelensky phone call and has carried over into the coronavirus. Because remember, impeachment wasn't that long ago. It was only voted on in February by the Senate. So this sticky narrative that occurred back then has carried over into the present. And you can obviously see in the writing of this writer that they are, hook, line, and sinker into this narrative about the president. So that's the first article. And now I want you to listen to this next article. And this is a little bit of a shift, but this is from National Review. And it's one of two pieces that I'm going to talk about today from a gentleman named David Harsanyi, who is a senior contributor. And it's basically a rant against the media. And in fact, the title of it is called A Rant Against the Media. Okay, I'm going to skip down and kind of go midway into the article and start quoting it. Okay. All right. Quote, why don't Republicans trust the media's reporting on Trump, you ask? We spent 3 feverish years chasing the Russian collusion whale, an imaginary beast created by Democratic Party operatives and brought to life by big-name reporters at major outlets. Inexplicably, all the mistakes these journalists made were skewed in the exact same direction every time. Yet to this day, networks that convinced half the country that a Russian asset had purloined the presidency have yet to explain how their high-profile reporters got so much wrong. Actually, these networks continue to feature the very same experts and guests, still opining with the very same confidence. Credit should be given to people such as Washington Post's Eric Wimple, though he is a rarity. Not only is there no price paid for getting things wrong, there really is no financial incentive to be a grounded, straight down the line, unbiased journalist these days. It's the Jim Acostas and Philip Ruckers of the world who get the book deals and big followings, not the diligent journalists poring over documents and offering serious, context-rich reporting. There are plenty of solid reporters, but the most of the big-name journalists are only big names because they are granted a perch of power by powerful corporations. Most of best-known reporters aren't especially talented writers or especially knowledgeable or especially good interviewers or especially adept at ferreting out important stories. They have access. They break stories because insiders with hostility toward an administration hand them incriminating or damaging information. All they have to do is show a modicum of skepticism and judiciousness in reporting those facts. Many rarely do. Moreover, journalists no longer act as competitive outlets. They act like a political tribe, sanctimoniously operating as if their vocation imbues them with some great knowledge or morality. CNN's Chris Cuomo can concoct a fabulous coronavirus resurrection, and virtually no journalist will speak up to defend their profession. MSNBC's Andy Lack will complain that Trump, who has done nothing to inhibit free speech, has shaken the soul of the First Amendment, but he offers not a word about the unprofessionalism of his market rival. No matter how bad ratings are, no matter how little trust they engender, and though the entire journalism project is predicated on trust, it engenders less than most institutions. Journalists do not grapple with the problems. Just look at the crass hypocrisy of the coverage of Biden's sexual assault allegations. One can be critical of the Trump presidency and still wrestle with obvious double standards of journalism. Instead, well-read media critic newsletters by reporters such as Brian Stelter have become indistinguishable from a Media Matters press release. So it's not a mystery why Trump's fans can so easily dismiss the media. Okay, so let's do the same thing. Principle of awareness. This author is trying to raise awareness and again appeal to perhaps the base of this author, but it's raising an awareness to somebody who might wonder why the right is skeptical about the media. And so if you're kind of curious and you're on the left and you're like, why the Republicans don't, listen to the news and why is it so difficult? They don't see what I see. And he's attempting to explain it in the sense that, hey, this is what's happened. This is the sticky narrative of the right. And you need to kind of understand that if you want to understand why there's so much skepticism of the press. And then it gives some examples about, not really being critical on the stories and he makes this comparison to Media Matters press release by Brian Stelter. And I thought that was a great analogy because Media Matters, their opposition research and their sole role in life is to go through, a whole bunch of content from right-wing outlets and then strip the context, distort it a little bit, and then fit it into a demonizing narrative about the right. and the right has cropped up with a few of these organizations themselves. But you can't really take anything Media Matters says seriously because that the context is going to be stripped and that it's going to be manipulated to mean something different than the original source. So in most cases. So I like how he also likens the current media to they more act like a political tribe. So principle of awareness, hey, are you aware that there's this thought out there that the media acts like a political tribe? Are you aware that this is the sticky narrative of the right? And discernment. So what's the purpose of this article? It's titled A Rant Against the Media. So the purpose is to just give a rant, and you can listen to it. You can choose not to listen to it. You can agree with it. You can choose not to agree with it. It's in that sense, it has a little bit of a persuasive element in that it's simply just saying, hey, here's what it is, guys. This is what I think. And it doesn't necessarily touch all of the confirmation bias buttons for the right. It is trying to go through and articulate why this rant is justified and warranted as he goes on. So that's a little bit about that article, and I thought I'd open with that because, one thing I've learned is when you lay all these news sources out and you have all these tabs open, New York Times, CNN, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, and you start looking at the headlines, and you look at Real Clear Politics, which does a nice job of matching opposing headlines together, and you just see how different people's thinking is about the same events. Scott Adams talks about two movies, seeing two movies on the same screen. So you can literally be sitting there with somebody right next to you, and you're watching the same movie, but you're seeing two of them. So So two movies. So you walk away with one perspective of what the movie meant, and then your friend who's on the other side of the aisle walks away with a completely different perspective of what that movie meant. So that's a little bit about the two movies critique and trying to understand awareness, discernment, and the sticky narrative portion of the dialogue publicly. So I have a. Okay, yeah. I mean, you can disagree, sure. I mean, they both appeal to their base. Like I said, I think I started with that. But one seems to be open to persuasion, the other one seems less open to persuasion, and that's my opinion. So okay, so let's get into COVID now. So COVID-19, where are we at? Well, Bloomberg has an interesting piece by Joe Nocera, who talks about lockdown critics possibly having a valid point. So there's this big back and forth between some people who think that we need to be locked down until we can really get the testing rolled out and maximize protection of life. And then there's others who said, well, wait a second, the original bargain was flatten the curve. We've flattened the curve. The health system is so far not overwhelmed, not even in New York City. Perhaps it was at certain locations for a short duration, but as a whole, as we're continuing to get cases across the country, we are not overwhelming our healthcare system. In fact, we have capacity that's not being used for other things, as I'll get into. So this author from Bloomberg has 4 contrarian arguments on reopening for consideration. Now, as far as I could tell, this writer doesn't have any kind of science background, or he's a journalist. So this is his take. And the reason that it jumped out at me is because, he talks about. I'm going to read a little bit of the opening, and then I'll talk about his arguments. So, and the reason I read the opening is because he points to some of the same sources I've been talking about over the last several weeks. 3 months after the first case of COVID-19 was diagnosed in the U.S., has the time come to start paying more attention to the critics? No, not the MAGA types foolishly protesting they have a constitutional right to endanger themselves and others by ignoring social distancing rules, and not the it's just the flu crowd either. I'm referring to people like John Ioannidis, the Stanford University School of Medicine scientist who argued early on that the coronavirus was less deadly than the models were predicting, or the Swedish epidemiologist John Geisik, who says that protecting the elderly and frail and allowing the rest of society to go about its business makes far more sense than lockdowns, whose efficacy, he believes, remains unproved. And yes, I'm even referring to Alex Berenson, the pugnacious former journalist who has become a national villain, except at Fox News, for poking holes at the conventional wisdom about how to mitigate the virus and pointing out the various harms that have resulted from measures like lockdowns. I don't agree with every claim the critics make. Some go as far as to dismiss the value of social distancing, the importance of which has become pretty clear since the coronavirus was first identified. But I believe it's always worth listening to smart people with ideas that go against the grain. As the online publication Unheard put it recently, the debate about lockdown is not a contest between good and evil. In that spirit, I would like to offer 4 contrarian arguments. Okay, the reason I wanted to read that is because I did a whole segment on John Geisik and the Unheard interview, the Swedish epidemiologist, largely responsible for the Swedish response to the pandemic. So I mentioned him. I've looked at some of the Stanford studies with John Ioannidis, and I've been kind of bringing a bunch of information to light that does cut against the grain, does suggest that we need to maintain a high state of awareness of the risk decision involved. And it isn't, the risk decision involves more than simply public health experts. It just does. It involves public policy experts. It involves economists. It involves business people. And I've mentioned for a long time that we have to be careful when the cure becomes worse than the disease. And this is a theme that's run through as soon as we started doing stay-at-homes and lockdowns and shutting down the economy. We had to go forward with a mindset of when does a cure become worse than the disease. So here's just 4 arguments that I'll briefly touch upon. So the first one is we're still acting like the original models are correct. So there was some modeling that was done. University of Washington was the one that we typically use in our country, but there was others done at Oxford and in the UK. And these models had assumptions. And I remember very early on, and you can go back in the shows and you can look, and I said, we have to be really careful about the assumptions, what assumptions we're making and how much weight we are giving to these models. You can't give zero weight. You have to lend some weight to these models, but you have to be in a position mentally, psychologically, to update your beliefs on these models as new information comes in. And his point in arguing this critique, we're still acting like the original models are correct, ties into my sticky narratives. Many people are anchored to those original models, even though there's new information that's come in about the infection fatality rate, for example, where the infection fatality rate looks like it's well under 1%, and it could be as low as 0.1%. I've seen some estimates that it's lower than 0.1%. So that should update, our thinking about these models. And I do a famous quote from George Box that says, all models are wrong, but some are useful, right? So if we know that all models are wrong, why have these sticky models in our minds in the national debate where we have so much more information? The antibody tests are revealing information. Now there's questions about their accuracy, of course, and I've covered that. But that's his first argument. The second argument is New York is not the rest of the country. New York City especially. New York City is very densely packed, as is some other parts of New York. And so, a one-size-fits-all policy, solution doesn't necessarily make sense because you have the subway, a huge subway system, mass movement of people every day, multiple times a day. So the infection rate in a place that's so densely packed is going to be different than if you're, say, in a neighboring state like Pennsylvania, or if you're in a neighboring state like Ohio. And as you go further west into the Midwest, where my wife's family's from. So different treatments. We have 50 different governors who know their states, and I think it's the right call to have them start to assess when they can open. We need to focus on the elderly. So all the data, all of it suggests that this overwhelmingly affects people over certain ages, 65, for example, and the fatal cases, and usually largely with pre-existing conditions. So we can smartly start to open up the economy to younger workers and still protect and isolate those who are most vulnerable. And that's not just what this author is suggesting, but that's a lot of suggestions in the reopening crowd. And then finally, we're overlooking damage that's caused by this single-minded focus on coronavirus. And he gives a couple examples. So there's other illnesses, there's other screenings that are not getting accomplished, there's other procedures that are getting put on hold. All these have trickle-down consequences in public health. So cancer screenings that are going undiagnosed or undone, and cancer that's going undiagnosed and not getting caught. There's other procedures that people have put off that is affecting their health. Hip replacements, knee replacements, those kinds of things. There's an increase in domestic violence. There's an impact on every single American family with children because their children are out of school. So that could affect their ability to perform their job and cause some stress inside the home. Now, I happen to think that it's nice for people to be forced to be with their families in stay-at-homes. I actually really enjoyed that myself, to build that good bond with my children. But it certainly affects everybody. So those were his four contrarian arguments, and I think that rather than demonizing the other side, we need to have good quality risk decisions. I use this aviation analogy where the only absolute safe way, to avoid an accident in aviation, it's pretty easy. Just don't fly, right? If you don't fly, you're not in danger of getting into an accident. That is the only foolproof risk, zero accidents guaranteed, right? As soon as you take off and an airline goes in the air or a helicopter goes in the air, you are assuming risk. And the best thing you can do is mitigate against that risk. And there is such a thing as an accident rate. There is such a thing as a fatality rate in aviation. Now, we've done pretty well in many of aviation sectors. Of course, there's always more work to do. But insurance companies and actuaries are looking at these risk decisions all the time, and they're assessing companies that have high risk operations like aviation, and they're covering these operators, and they're putting direct numbers into the risk. They're covering for certain amounts of money in the unfortunate event of an accident. So there's a whole profession out there that does risk decisions for a living. Now, are you aware of that? You may not be aware of that, but in the aviation field, I've dealt with it firsthand. So, because because the reopened crowd wants to engage in risk decisions, where is the risk? Is the risk entirely with the state government or the local government or the federal government? Is that where the predominance of the risk lies, the risk decision lies? Or is the risk with the individual? Or is the risk with the small business? Where does the risk, weigh? And I think this is a big dialogue between individuals assuming more risk for themselves and their families versus the government at whatever level it is, whether it's local, state, or federal, starting to take away those risk decisions from the populace. So it's a very interesting federalist discussion and thing that we probably might not even think about unless this was happening. So that's enough on the lockdowns. Now, the Wall Street Journal reports that the EU is having a record contraction for the first quarter. So they're reporting that the EU has shrunk. Let's see, the Eurozone's gross domestic product fell 3.8% versus the final 3 months of 2019, according to the data released Thursday, as measures imposed to limit the pandemic's spread stalled everything from schools to factories to churches. The economy shrank by 14.4% on an annual basis, far exceeding the 4.8% contraction in the U.S. economy over the same period. That largely reflects Europe's earlier and broader lockdown. So a 14% reduction is really startling. I didn't know it was going to be that big, and we might see the impacts of this depending on how long the shutdown continues. Hopefully, the economy bounces back in Europe, like we're hoping it does here. But that's a huge contraction, and that's having that's going to have some trickle down unintended consequences that we're going to become aware of in the weeks and months ahead. So that's from the Wall Street Journal. And then CNN had a piece on unemployment benefits, and I have personal experience with this. So with the care package and the extra $600 in unemployment benefits that everybody gets for, I think, 13 weeks or whatever the time frame is, what we're actually finding is that unemployment can pay more than lost jobs. So when a company gets a PPP loan like we did, all of a sudden we look at rehiring employees back, and we look at what they're possibly getting with unemployment with this extra $600 versus what their prior pay rate was with us, which was above minimum wage. So we weren't paying anybody minimum wage or close to that, and we're competing with unemployment to get people to come back to work, which is kind of crazy. And this was raised in the legislation. In fact, Senator Graham was saying, "Hey, let's cap it at what they were making at in their current position, and not allow it to go above that," which would have been a nice amendment in terms of getting people back. Because what it's doing is it's increasing our payroll. So if you increase payroll, you're increasing the money you're using through the PPP, and then in the aftermath of this, if the demand doesn't come back, these people are just sadly, the reality is if you have no demand to maintain a business, then you're just going to go back to unemployment. And the company's either going to shut down or minimize or whatever to try to weather the storm until demand comes back. So in the case of Hawaii, I think the maximum weekly benefit, I think, is around $660-ish. So the federal add-on essentially doubles the unemployment benefit, which is pretty crazy. So now we're literally, I've hired about 16 people in the last 2 days, back to the small business I'm a part of. And I've had questions about that. Like, hey, this is what I'm making, or I stand to make. What can you guys do? So that's a challenge for employers. And if you're an employer or you're a company owner, small business owner, or in management, you're seeing the same thing. I'm sure you are. Then there's another piece in the Wall Street Journal that talks about colleges and the impact on colleges. So we've got the EU contracting. We've got this unemployment now competing with lost jobs. We've got colleges, especially for private colleges, getting pushed to the breaking point. So this is being reported in the Wall Street Journal as well, that you're going to have these you could have this huge revolution in the education system as more goes online, as people start to not commute to school, not attend school. They don't accept admittance for the fall because this thing is likely going to go into the fall, the impacts of it. So it's kind of looking bleak for a lot of these universities. And, just a couple quotes from this. The world order has changed, said Sundar Kumarasamy, Vice President for Enrollment and Management of Northeastern University, where 18% of students are international and may not be able or willing to travel to the U.S. come fall. When we build models, we don't have a variable called virus. For many schools, a pandemic is exposing flaws in their own business models. Even before the virus hit, many colleges and universities were running at razor-thin margins, with 30% of those rated by Moody's Investors Service showing operating deficits. Published tuition rates have skyrocketed, but few students actually paid full price. Gets into it. Okay, so this is really interesting. What is happening? Every source of funding is in doubt. Schools face tuition shortfalls because of unpredictable enrollment and market-driven endowment losses. Public institutions are digesting steep budget cuts, while families are questioning whether it's worth paying for a private school if students will have to take classes online from home. So it's going to shake up the education industry in major, major ways, especially with the technology we have available to us today. And I think this will probably, in the long term, be a good thing, because if you can bring down the cost of education, make it higher quality, and transfer more of it onto online, you're gonna make it better for the entire country. And the access to education is going to get less and less difficult to each and every member of society at very low cost. So I think that the shakeup is going to be good, but in the short term, it's going to be very painful because some colleges are going to close. There's, this article starts with a college in Illinois, liberal arts school in Illinois that's closing after 174 years. They just can't meet the bills. So education is suffering. We've got unemployment competing for jobs. And over the world, there's a New York Times piece that talks about millions had risen out of poverty, and now they're in danger of going back into poverty. So this is pretty good. Experts say for the first time since 1998, global poverty will probably increase. At least 500 million people could slip into destitution by the end of the year. So why would half a billion people start to slip into destitution by the end of the year? Well, I think when you get into this article, it talks about the economic impact, the whole world economy shutting down, and that people simply can't make, they go backwards when the economy shuts down. Like many people who are entry-level positions and needing to go on unemployment, they start to go backwards, or people who don't qualify for unemployment for various reasons. So I think we're going to see that, for as much flack as capitalism takes, the fact that the engine of the world, the world economy was humming for the last 30 or 40 years and was able to elevate literally, tremendous amount of the world's population out of poverty, but is telling of the impact of capitalism. So for the first time since 1998, the World Bank says global poverty rates are forecast to rise. By the end of the year, 8% of the world's population, or 500 million people, may be pushed into destitution, largely because of the pandemic. Let's see. Let me see if there's any other big picture. Okay, in a matter of mere months, the coronavirus has wiped out global gains that took 2 decades to achieve, leaving an estimated 2 billion people at risk of abject poverty. However, indiscriminate the virus may be in its spread, it has repeatedly proven itself anything but that when it comes to its effect on the world's most vulnerable communities. So this is sad because no one wants poverty rates to increase. I think we can agree on that. And hopefully, if the world economy just there's nothing fundamentally wrong. Now we're going to have some trade issues that come out of this because there are some national security points that we need to think about. Maybe it's not wise to have pharmaceuticals made in China and, where the virus began. Maybe we want pharmaceuticals to be made in maybe a couple different places, to include here at home, because then you're not, at the mercy of a foreign power for your own public health. And I think that's some lessons that we've learned, and that's some stuff that's come out of the administration. So that's going to be shaken up out of this whole thing. But hopefully, as we open up, and that's why I'm an advocate of reopening, because we need to get back to work. Because if you have 500 million people go back down into poverty, the cure is worse than the disease. We're not going to have 500 million people die from coronavirus. We're not going to have 500 million people die from COVID-19. We're just not. So I think that this helps to raise awareness, really raise awareness of the impact of this global shutdown. And I'm liking that Europe is starting to open up. I'm liking that the States are starting to look at opening up. So we'll see how it goes. Okay, and then you may have seen this. This wasn't really reported in the U.S. media. At least I didn't see it. But it was reported in The Guardian, and this came through some connections of mine overseas. China is starting to experiment with their own digital currency. So they have this electronic currency that they're experimenting with, and they're pegging it to their own internal yen or yuan or whatever the name of it is. And so this has caused some nervousness in global markets, because it could be an indicator that China is going to move off pegging to the dollar. And this could have some implications down the road economically. And many analysts think that this could be like economic war between the U.S. and China. So it's not clear that that's what this move means. We might find out more information as we go, and find out if indeed this is what they're planning on doing. Now, according to the Guardian article, they're basically experimenting with digital currency in certain cities inside China. So it's not universal across China yet, but they're experimenting with it to see how it works. So it's almost like I think it's the first digital currency, almost cryptocurrency, that any country is experimenting with. So it might be interesting just to see what happens from just a curiosity perspective. But that's going on. All right, so I'm going to transition a little bit into politics. Of course, Michael Flynn is a big story right now with all the revelations coming from the FBI investigation. And I've advocated to not trust or distrust any news agency specifically. Like, don't write off the entire New York Times. Don't write off the entire Washington Post. Don't write off the entire Breitbart News, if you're on the other side, because there's valuable information still in those publications. And there's good reporters, good journalists whose purpose is to elevate your awareness and teach you information that you may not be aware of. So that's true in all the publications. Also, if you look away from legacy media and into new media, independent journalists, John Solomon, Joel Pollack, but he's with Breitbart, Tim Pool, who was on Joe Rogan. If you look at other independents, they have a real interesting perspective too. They can really look at a story in a way that legacy media might not be willing to do. So I would suggest find the journalists you trust, whether it's at the Washington Post, or the New York Times, or Independence, or Breitbart, and follow them and read their thinking, get comfortable with their thinking. Doesn't mean you have to outsource your thinking to them, but it can help build your awareness of the overarching dialogue. Most pieces, if we're honest, most pieces today, they don't have the other side. They might have a caricature of the other side, but in most cases, they don't even mention it. They don't mention it, and you may not be aware that there is another side. That's how bad I think it's gotten. So activate your imagination. If you're not hearing the other side, imagine what it might be, and then maybe go look at a different source to see what the other side is. So Michael Flynn, Just the News. This is John Solomon's website. So he posts today. Oh, do I want to get to this first? I might not have put this in here. Okay. Oh, I did want to touch upon one more thing with the reopening. So on the Hill, there's a piece by Graham Allison, and I wanted to mention him because I knew him when I was in grad school. And it's pretty good. So The struggle between President Trump's drive to reopen American economy as quickly as possible and the insistence by his public health team and many others that this has to be delayed until further hurdles are overcome is largely a false dilemma. Now, I'm a big believer that a lot of issues in our society are false dilemmas, with the exception perhaps of social issues. But I think climate change and immigration and healthcare, I think a lot of these are false dilemmas. But I'm going to have to cover that that's beyond the scope of this podcast. I think I'm going to do a standalone show on those kinds of things. So we can simultaneously increase protection for those who are most vulnerable to coronavirus and, with appropriate precautions, reopen most of our economy and society. The key to unlocking this false dilemma is a clear understanding of who, in fact, is most vulnerable to death from this novel killer and who is not. As data from the deaths of the more than 58,000 of our fellow citizens to date show, the answer is clear. Those at greatest risk of death from coronavirus are a subset of the 15% of Americans older than 65. More than 80% of all deaths in America from coronavirus have come from this group. Moreover, the data shows that vulnerability increases with age beyond 65, especially among individuals with one or more specific pre-existing conditions. And among those who have died, 3 of every 5 have been males. In the death toll to date, how many were individuals under 25? Of the 200 million Americans under 45, how many have died from this novel virus? The answers are fewer than 100 among people under 25 and fewer than 1,000 under 45s. Thus, in contrast to the specter of the nation at risk, when properly understood, coronavirus should be seen as a big threat to a small percentage of our population and a small threat to the overwhelming majority. To clarify this increased danger, it is instructive to distinguish between before coronavirus appeared and after coronavirus appeared. And then he goes on to expand. But I thought that was a great way to frame it. And it also links to a study that was put out by the Belfer Center at Harvard Kennedy School, which is where I went. And Graham Allison is there. So the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. And I wanted to read this because I've had a theme of experts and models that's kind of gone throughout my shows for the last 4 weeks. And yesterday I read a great piece by The Atlantic that had some really interesting things to say about experts and models. So if you want to see that, go to yesterday's show and look for the section about the Atlantic article. So to frame it, in the Atlantic article, it talked about experts and about skepticism of experts and about how experts have value because they oftentimes have studied things for decades, and therefore their amount of knowledge, their knowledge base about a particular issue is relevant in many contexts. And then there's also a discussion about people outside of an expertise thinking they know more or thinking they can offer value when maybe in fact they don't, maybe in fact they can't. But also, I've talked about how a professor of mine was an economist, and he spent his career basically tearing down epidemiologists and medical journals for shoddy methodology. So I think there's this fog of war in experts and models, and there's this vigorous academic debate that's happening. And part of the article yesterday pointed out to this academic debate that's kind of mainstream and, well, that's common in academic circles is now getting more and more out into the public. And so the academic debate is happening in more of a public forum. And what's happening is the public is latching on to whichever expert or whichever model they can use as a cudgel to attack their political opponents. And that's not necessarily good. But what is interesting and what I've found is you have all kinds of different expertise that's getting brought into the mix. And the discerning portion, the principle of discernment, is helpful because, and I described a Medium article that I read where I was drawn in because it confirmed what I think about reopening and about this virus. And then I looked down in the comments and you had very, very smart people pointing out errors in the methodology of the writer. So all that is background for what Graham Allison is going to say in this study. And so I wanted to read a quick quote. Thus, the reservations about venturing into territory outside our normal wheelhouse, and in full certainty that some of what we write here will in retrospect turn out to have been wrong, a team of researchers at the Belfer Center and I have been collecting all the data we have been able to find about coronavirus, analyzing it in the best of our ability, and debating competing answers to the fundamental questions about the challenge this novel virus poses to our nation. What follows is our current first approximation of a work in progress. We are posting at this point in the hope of stimulating a wider debate that will include a much larger number of analysts beyond public health professionals and epidemiologists, including in particular intelligence officers, financial wizards, historians, and others. While respecting the extraordinary efforts of the public health professionals and medical community are now doing in the midst of the fight, we nonetheless need to begin by recognizing that they may have fundamentally misdiagnosed the challenge coronavirus poses to our society. In the language of the U.S. intelligence community, we need a Team B competitor that is prepared to begin by questioning everything, beginning with the data our current collection process has produced as a starting point for the current diagnosis. So I love this analysis because Graham Allison is more international affairs and strategy, international strategy and whatnot. And with a military background, I totally understand this Team B concept. It's like an aggressor force or like a red cell within a military exercise. And that is a group of people dedicated to questioning everything and finding holes in the prevailing knowledge and the prevailing methods and tactics and implementation that's happening, the execution that's currently happening. So I love this concept, and it really, for me, clarifies some of my own thinking about how we think about experts outside the field of epidemiology adding to the discussion about this virus. And certainly, most of us recognize that economists have a lot to offer in terms of when the cure becomes worse than the disease financially and economically. But I thought I'd do that because, I have personal experience back there, and I thought it relevant to a lot of the themes of the show in the last several weeks. So where am I in terms of... Okay. All right. Okay, now moving on to Flynn. So according to John Solomon, Just the News, the FBI found no derogatory Russian evidence on Flynn, planned to close the case before leaders intervened. So let's get into it. Evidence withheld for years from Michael Flynn's defense team shows the FBI found no derogatory Russia evidence against the former Trump national security advisor, and that counterintelligence agents had recommended closing down the case with a defensive briefing before the Bureau's leadership intervened in January 2017. The recommendation to close the case came 16 days before President Trump took office, with plans to have Flynn serve as his national security advisor, and after agents had found no incriminating evidence by sweeping counterintelligence files and talking to confidential human sources, the memos show. Flynn was given a code name during this thing, and then this is a quote: the absence of any derogatory information or lead information from these logical sources reduced the number of investigative avenues and techniques to pursue. Per the direction of FBI management, Crossfire Razor was not interviewed as part of the case closing procedure. The FBI is closing this investigation, the agent wrote on January 4th, 2017. So January 4th is interesting because what happens next... So the files show the plan was to provide Flynn with a defensive briefing so he could be aware of potential pitfalls with Russians he had started in his new job in the White House. But then the lead agent in the larger Russia case, Peter Strzok, intervened to stop the case from being closed and pivoted the discussion towards seeking an interview with Flynn, FBI text messages show. In the text message to his team, Strzok specifically cited the 7th floor of FBI headquarters, where then Director James Comey and then Deputy Director Andrew McCabe worked as the reason he intervened. And here's a text. Hey, if you haven't closed Razor, don't do it yet, Strzok texted on January 4th, 2017, the same day they recommended the closing. It's still open and I'm still listed as the manager, his colleague texted back. Roger, I couldn't raise earlier. Please keep it open for now, Strzok texted. Later he added, 7th floor involved. The text messages show the discussion pivoted from the closing the case to seeking an interview with Flynn and suggest there was a dispute between McCabe and his top counterintelligence official, Assistant Director William Priestep, who appeared to be concerned the FBI was being unfair to Flynn. And then it goes on. There's some other texts. So what's interesting is this is adding to what we learned yesterday, which is these handwritten notes that were in preparation for the Flynn interview, where they actually intended to catch him in a trap and get him to admit to breaking this law that was written in 1799, the Logan Act. So this is not good for the FBI. This really is not good. And then Kimberly Strassel over at the Wall Street Journal has an excellent, excellent piece on this. And I'll read a little bit of it. Mr. Flynn in 2017 pleaded guilty to a single count of lying to FBI agents about conversations he had with Sergei Kislyak, Russia's ambassador to the U.S. Thanks to new documents the feds belatedly turned over to his attorneys, we know the FBI engineered this crime. Handwritten notes from former FBI counterintelligence head Bill Priestep, made before the Bureau's interview of Mr. Flynn, asked the following: what is our goal? Truth admission, or to get him to lie so we can prosecute him or get him fired? Question mark. One of the frustrations of the Trump-Russia collusion narrative is that the evidence of law enforcement's abuse of power keeps emerging in dribs and drabs. To grasp the outrageous conduct fully, the Flynn documents need to be added to what we already know. The overall evidence paints a scandalous picture. Having labored and abysmally failed in 2016 to build a case that Mr. Flynn was an agent of the Russians, the FBI and Justice Department changed gears, rifling through his communications, inventing a fake crime, and entrapping him on a lying charge. The latest documents reveal the FBI was officially closing its Flynn case on January 4th, 2017. The FBI's Crossfire Hurricane team spent 2016 checking databases for derogatory information on him, running down accusations that he had lied, he had ties to Russians. They struck out, and the closing document admits Mr. Flynn was no longer a viable candidate for investigation. Then suddenly, also on January 4th, FBI agent Peter Strzok sends a text. Hey, if you haven't closed it, don't do so. 7th floor involved. So that's the story. This is very interesting. Now, Vox, for the counterpoint, has an article titled "The New Michael Flynn Documents Aren't the Bombshell Trump is Making Them Out to Be." And I want to just draw awareness to how this article is worded and kind of the structure of it. So here we go. President Donald Trump on Thursday seized upon new developments in the Michael Flynn case to reinvigorate his pet conspiracy theories about Obama-era law enforcement intelligence community officials conspiring to bring him down. So I love how it begins with Donald Trump. It's a Michael Flynn story, but it begins with Donald Trump. What happened to General Flynn, a war hero, should never be allowed to happen to a citizen of the United States, Trump thundered on Twitter. Trump's latest string of tweets about the Flynn case came days after he tweeted a post from Fox Business host Maria Bartiromo teasing that sources tell me General Flynn will be completely exonerated this week. It was a total fraud, a setup. Suffice it to say that nothing has emerged this week that delivers on that promise. First, some brief backstory. After being fired from his position as head of the Defense Intelligence Agency by President Obama in 2014, Flynn cozied up to Russia and became one of Trump's more prominent campaign surrogates. Trump ignored advice Obama gave him during their November 2016 White House meeting and tapped him to be his first national security advisor. But Flynn planted the seeds of his own undoing before he even started the job by having secretive communications with Russian officials during the transition period. Now, however, Trump world wants you to believe that Flynn was a victim and is using newly released documents to make the case. So notice how persuasive the language is. It starts with Trump, and if you have an opinion on Trump, you're immediately going to be emotionally engaged with how you feel about Trump, especially if you're on the left. And then it doesn't even get to the background information until paragraph 3 or 4. And then the background information starts with him being fired by Obama. So Trump, emotional response, and then the first data set is that he was fired by Obama. So maybe you like Obama. So now Obama fires him in 2014. Oh, yeah, this guy must have been a shady guy, right? So that's immediately how you're anchored before you know anything about the documents, right? You may have not heard about the documents. You may have heard the documents came out. You don't know what they say. But this is how this article is introducing the information to its readers. And I thought I'd go through that because there's a huge difference. And if you are prone to confirmation bias on this side, where you like Obama, you hate Trump, and you know there's some stuff coming out that those Republicans are saying is pretty damning of the FBI, well, if this is the way you get introduced to this information, it's going to make you think, yeah, those guys don't have anything. They don't have anything. So I wanted to point that out because I thought it was so fascinating. But Kimberly Strassel had a Twitter thread that I think helps to clarify the context and raise our awareness even further. And she says, to really understand how outrageous these new Flynn documents are, we have to add to everything we already know. And key is remembering that the FBI had no reason to interview Flynn. It already had transcripts of his conversations with Kislyak. So it already had the transcripts. The new docs show FBI had already cleared Flynn of ludicrous claims that he was an agent of Russian power. It moved to close the investigation on January 4th, 2017. But then DOJ cooked up the absurd Logan Act claim, and that is referenced in this Vox article. I should find that bit because I forgot to include that. Let's see. Okay. FBI leadership was already aware that at that time that Flynn had phone calls with then Russian Ambassador Sergei Kislyak during the presidential transition period. In those calls, Flynn advised Kislyak not to respond to the new sanctions of Obama's administration placed on Russia for interfering on Trump's behalf in the just completed presidential election. Intercepts of Flynn's conversations with Kislyak raised concerns within the Bureau that Flynn had violated the Logan Act, a law that prohibits unauthorized citizens from negotiating with foreign governments. So there's the Logan Act. But, okay, they had the transcripts with Sergei Kislyak, and then this Logan Act didn't rise to the level of continuing the investigation. So the FBI agents actually recommended closing the investigation January 4th, and then that was stopped. And then they did the interview of General Flynn. And I talked a couple days ago about how they threatened to prosecute his son. And the agreement to plead guilty involved them not prosecuting his son. And I'm not sure why they would prosecute his son. I didn't discover that information yet. And so to protect his son, Flynn pled guilty. And that agreement was kept from the court. That was secretive and kept from the court. And then it was released last week or in the last couple of days, like very, very recently. And no one knew this. So there's the Logan Act in the Vox article. Now, Kimberly Strassel, her framing. Let's see. Again, if they thought he violated Logan, all they had to do was prosecute. They had the transcript. Their problem? They knew such ridiculousness would never fly. So how else to nail Flynn? As the notes show, Logan just became the pretext for interview. The real goal was to trap him into saying something at odds with transcript and to get him to lie. And the evidence of that strategy is everywhere. We have Comey bragging that he went around the White House legal counsel, so Flynn would have no representation. We have a new email from Lisa Page asking how FBI can get around issuing to Flynn the standard admonition against lying, suggesting Strzok just casually slipped that in. We have McCabe docs showing he discouraged him from getting a lawyer. The FBI decided to get rid of standard admonition altogether. Also did not tell Flynn he was being interviewed in an investigatory context, suggesting this was a chat between government officials. As for liberal commentators, legal scholars saying all this is routine, well, let's sure hope it's not. The FBI exists to investigate crimes, not create them. So that's Kimberly Strassel. All this, and General Flynn had the tweet of the century, according to Scott Adams. So the backstory on this is James Comey, after he left government and did the interview circuit, he would start to tweet these videos of him in nature with trees, and he would kind of pan around and look at the trees and go up and look at the canopy of the trees. Really interesting. There's rarely any kind of commentary, just these pictures of nature, and he would tweet these out. So General Flynn has a tweet today that is kind of panning the trees, and then it slowly stops on an American flag, and it's just a great tweet. It's only got 4.7 million views as of right now, but you should check it out. Go look at General Flynn's Twitter account to find that. All right, so all right, so that's enough on Flynn. I think that this is going to continue, and I don't think it's going to go well for the FBI. It's going to really undermine the credibility of the FBI with the American public. In my view, institutions that have a lot of power, and there's gray area. I don't know that there is necessarily, I won't say for sure that there was ill intent. It could be the case that these agents were trying as best they could to act in good faith. Of course, they had prior beliefs. Of course, they might have thought that there was legitimate threat of Russian entanglement and interference. That's all possible. But it does seem like suggest that there was some, maybe illicit motivations in this particular case. And that calls a lot into question. So there we go. All right, moving on, I want to talk about Tara Reade. And the Washington Post has an article. It's a commentary about how to turn the biggest crisis into opportunity. And And I thought that interesting. Or actually, was this Washington Post? This might have been Politico. So, stand by. Oh, okay. I wanted to. Yeah, before I get to that article, I want to talk about this Politico article that is titled "No, the Media Isn't Burying the Biden Allegations." So I covered yesterday the Real Clear Politics article that compared the mentions of the major outlets on the two stories of Christine Blasey Ford and Tara Reade. And I also covered the treatment that the New York Times presented with both cases by looking at the article on Easter for Tara Reade and the article back in September 2018 on Christine Blasey Ford. And I pointed out the stylistic differences and kind of the discernment, the principle of discernment at work in those two articles. So you can go find that in the archives. So this article says, no, the media isn't burying the Biden story. And I want to skip down to a piece, a part a little bit down. And so this author says, so while I might have favored more aggressive coverage of the Biden accusation, I'm at peace with why it didn't take off with the velocity of the Kavanaugh charges. For reasons good and bad, the press tends to move faster on a story when it is part of an official proceeding, like a trial, a special counsel's investigation, or a Supreme Court nomination. Reporters benefit from having stacks of transcripts, depositions, interviews, testimony, bank records, et al. At their disposal, as well as witnesses to interview. Public hearings also set journalists on fire. They delighted professionally. That is, when Anita Hill gave witness against Clarence Thomas's nomination in the Supreme Court. They did the same as independent counsel Kenneth Starr built his paper case against President Bill Clinton. Likewise, the Mueller investigation and the Kavanaugh hearings unleashed layers of evidence for reporters to wade through and mold into copy. The greater the evidentiary bounty, the larger the media bonfire. So that was information that I hadn't considered before. So one narrative on my side, on the right, would be that the lack of coverage is this huge hypocrisy in treatment of sexual allegations, sexual misconduct against two prominent men on opposite sides of the political spectrum. This author is offering a slightly different narrative, and that is, well, any proceeding, like a nomination and a hearing, a public hearing, is going to get more attention just by the nature of the information available. So the Tara Reade, by contrast, is more of an investigative journalism type of endeavor. There's not a whole lot of public information. There's not a public hearing. There's not transcripts. There's not all this stuff. And so as a natural consequence of just the sheer amount of information out there, there's going to be slightly different coverages. And I think that's probably plausible. I think that that's probably a variant that I wasn't aware of. So I think there's a multivariate. There's certainly prior beliefs and probably some hypocrisy that's going on, but there's probably also some viability to this explanation. So this writer is basically trying to explain the lower coverage because of that kind of explanation. And yesterday, of course, I covered the Biden versus Kavanaugh, how it stacks up in the Me Too movement, and it's pretty insane that that Christine Blasey Ford was mentioned 1,898 times on CNN, 1,878 times on MSNBC, and Fox News 1,066. Tara Reade's name was mentioned in the last month, Fox News 57 times, CNN 9 times, MSNBC just once. And then Google searches. So this was showing the real different treatment of the two cases. But I wanted to point out that Politico article because, one thing Jordan Peterson says is assume anybody you're talking to, and that includes interacting with a writer through a piece, has something to teach you. And even though Politico tends to be on the other side, I thought that was an interesting explanation for the disparity in coverage. And I won't say that that's the full explanation. I don't know if I'm persuaded that that's the full explanation, but I think it's probably one variable among a few that would generate that disparity in coverage. So then the Washington Post has another piece that talks about Biden, and this is the one I was getting to earlier, how Joe Biden can turn his biggest crisis into an opportunity. So it's by Karen Tumulty, who's a columnist, and she basically says that what Biden should do to turn this into an opportunity is he should appoint, find a kind of an independent panel that can go through his Senate records that are up in the Delaware Library, University of Delaware Library, and can go through all the boxes, and they're independent, they don't have an agenda, and they can try to find out if there's any kind of record of sexual misconduct that Miss Reed filed, which she claims that she did file with the Senate office back in 1993. So what Biden should do is name a small group of well-respected impartial researchers, historians, academics, archivists, and then he should ask the University of Delaware to give them access to his papers as soon as the precautions put in place as a result of the novel coronavirus are loosened. My own experience with the solitary endeavor of digging through boxes of documents suggests it would not be all that hard to practice rudimentary social distancing. A team of independent researchers could probably get through the material in a matter of weeks or a couple months at the most. They could then issue a report on whether they found anything that was relevant to what Reed claimed happened to her. It would then be incumbent upon Biden to make those records public. So that's her suggestion. So this is starting to snowball. Washington Post columnist comes out and suggests this. Excuse me. And then second time mentioning David Harsanyi at the National Review, Biden's disgraceful hypocrisy on sexual misconduct. Now, in this piece, he points out that in 2011, the Obama DOJ's Dear Colleague letter directed institutions of higher learning to adjudicate sexual assault and misconduct cases under Title IX, not by a clear and convincing evidence standard, but by a preponderance of evidence. The letter also strongly discouraged cross-examination of alleged victims, one of the fundamental methods of determining truth, because it, quote, may be traumatic or intimidating to the alleged victim. After Secretary of Education Betsy DeVos proposed new rules to reinstate some semblance of impartiality in the process, Biden and a number of other Democrats engaged in a smear campaign against her. So what this is showing is that Biden himself was looking to lower the standards of evidence for sexual assault cases and misconduct cases in colleges. And you may recall this is probably back when the Duke lacrosse thing was hitting the news, and some stories that came out that turned out to be unfounded, lots of accusations, and there was marches on campus about this kind of thing. And so this is Joe Biden lowering the standards of evidence, which is ironical because now he's kind of in the crossfire about this thing. And of course, the due process defense comes out in strong chorus by the Democrats for this, and I understand that. And maybe Tara Reid didn't do anything, but what I really love is Trump's response to this. So Trump had a tweet, and I guess he was asked about, or he had a quote. He was asked about Tara Reid, and he said, "I don't know anything about it. I don't." They might be fictitious. I know a lot about false claims, but Joe should answer. so it's kind of a funny tweet that Trump said. So we should get more details tomorrow morning, because tomorrow morning Joe Biden goes on Joe Scarborough in Morning Joe. So we should find out more in about less than 12 hours. Won't that be interesting? So I'll wake up tomorrow to the Twitter sphere, of course, going crazy about that. I'm sure that the trends will happen immediately, and we'll find out. I'm just more interested in seeing how he presents himself, and if he's going to be tripping over his words in presenting his defense, because I do think that the evidence or the observation suggests that he's in cognitive decline. Whether he is or not, I'm not a doctor, but just him stumbling over his words on a routine basis. Democrats, let's do the right thing. Let's get somebody competent in there. It could be Amy Klobuchar. It could be Andrew Cuomo. Somebody who is viable and competent. Now, it's probably going to be a woman, and that's fine. Amy Klobuchar would be my pick out of the ones that are available. I disagree with her socially, but I think she's at least competent and moderate, and understands the other side more so than the other candidates lead on to believe. So that's my 2 cents. That's the brunt of it. I hope you enjoyed the content. I hope you learned something new. I'm glad to see some comments. I had a commenter who said that they teach at a local college. So liked what I had to say about the disruptive shaking the box of education with this coronavirus. And I hope we're better. I hope we're better for it. I hope we're stronger. I'm optimistic. I hope you're optimistic. Americans are optimistic by nature. Join me if you're from other places around the world. Be optimistic with us because the future is bright. We will get through this. Even if it looks bad now, it's temporary, and the future is going to be good. That's the brunt of it. I'm Joel Van Brunt. I will see you tomorrow.